Cause of Crying and Laughing Chapter 15. The willow bank feels the vicissitudes of life and the shadows disappear. Tanjian listens to the night rain and the falling trees are chilled. But Helena suddenly sighed, and Mrs. Tao asked her why. She smiled and said, "What's the reason for sighing by chance?" Mrs. Tao smiled and said, "This doesn't make sense. Now someone suddenly bursts into tears or laughs. Can you say that there is no reason? Sigh. It's also a feeling of injustice, and of course, there is a reason for it. Bo, he often said, if there is injustice, what point are you complaining about?" Helena said, "It doesn't matter if you say it, but it's just a bit childish. I think a person who has cultivated to become a god is finally blessed, but they all have differences, so it's even harder to say in this world." Jiashu couldn't help it anymore and said, "Is Miss He telling the story of the double stars? The Milky Way is filled with countless stars." Bohe stopped him and said, come on, who doesn't know this? This kind of myth, no matter whether it is true or false, can add some interesting material to our dry and boring life. Whether we use it to relieve boredom or not, it does not hinder material civilization, so why bother to expose it? For example, people in Europe and the United States have Santa Claus on Christmas night, which inevitably increases children's superstitious ideas. However, to this day, children's elders still pretend to be Santa Claus, which is nothing more than a funny word. Jiashu smiled and said, "Okay, I declare failure." Mrs. Tao said, "In fact, it is a last resort for a lady to excuse herself by using the gods to say farewell. Taking a step back and thinking about it, if you still have to prove that gods don't have that problem, it would be a big disgrace." Miss Ho, do you think what I said is right? Helena said, "They are all right." Mrs. Tao laughed and said, "That's weird. How could everything be right?" Helena said, "Why aren't everything right? Mr. Fan gave me common sense correction, and Mr. Tao gave me spiritual experience." Mrs. Tao smiled and said, "You are really good at talking. You won't offend anyone." When they were debating here, the family tree was silent again. Bohe and his wife didn't pay much attention to it, but Helena already knew it. The more you see that he has nothing to do, the more unhappy he becomes. It seems that his unhappiness was not brought from the south, but something new he felt after returning to Beijing. What's that? Could it be that his girlfriend is dissatisfied with him? Helena thought so, and fell silent. In this tea house only Bo and his wife were left talking. After sitting for a while, Mrs. Tao felt that they were a little depressed, so she suggested going home. "Bo," he said, "our car is at the back door. We are not going to the sea." Mrs. Tao said, "It is so late at night. Do you want Miss He to go to the South Bank alone?" "Bo," he said, "let's give the family tree a gift. When you get to the front door, let Miss He's car take you home." Helena said, "It doesn't matter. I'll take the boat to Yilin Hall." Mrs. Tao said, "There's still a long way from Yilin Hall to the gate." When she heard this, she became silent. Jiashu felt that if he kept silent at all, he would be pretending to be deaf, which would be very disrespectful. He said, "You're welcome. I'll see Miss He off." Bohe suddenly stood up, clapped his hands for a while, and said with a smile, "Very good. Very good. That's it." Jiashu smiled and said, "There's no need to applaud." Bohe left with his wife without deepening his argument. Here Helena slowly stood up, and was about to raise her hands to stretch. She only raised her hands slightly, and then put them down again. She looked at the family tree and smiled, and said, "I have to help you again. We won't sit down. Ship, please go over there, okay?" Jiashu smiled and said casually. When the two of them walked to the east bank again, the locust trees were dark and gloomy. Far, far away, there is an electric lamp which emits blue light when reflected by the leaves of the trees. There is a wide and long road under the woods, which is getting deeper and deeper. It takes a long time to walk before 2 or 3 people meet, so it is very quiet. The two of them walked on the road step by step. You can hear the thumping sound of feet. In this silent state, it was as if I could smell a kind of fragrance from Helena's clothes, rippling in the evening breeze, only following people in the air. Walking under the shade of the trees, with the light behind them, there were pairs of figures hiding on the exposed chairs. At the same time, there was a kind of chatter, which was particularly harsh in the gloomy night sky. Staying away from the exposed chair, Helena smiled at him and said, "What do you think about the behavior of these people?" Jiashu said, "It doesn't matter how you feel." Helena said, A person may have good feelings about the things in front of him. It doesn't matter if it's bad or bad, but you can't have any feelings at all. Jiashu said, you said it's about the things in front of you? The more things are in front of you, the less likely you are to have any feelings. For example, we must have chopsticks and bowls when we eat every day. What will you think when you see the chopsticks and bowl? Lena said with a smile. What you said is a bit unreasonable. How can this kind of thing be the same as eating? Jiashu said, I'm afraid it won't happen again. If it doesn't reach this level, no matter who sees it, they won't have any thoughts. Lena said with a smile. Although you don't talk much, if you say something, people won't be able to refute it. That's right. Are you so unwilling to express your attitude on anything? Jiashu laughed unconsciously, but Lena couldn't help but fell silent again. The two walked along the east bank and were about to go out of the gate. They walked onto a long stone bridge. The lotus leaves under the bridge were piled on top of each other, but there was no water in sight. Lena suddenly stopped and said, the lotus leaves are too lush here, please walk slowly. Then she leaned on the stone railing of the bridge and looked down. There was no moonlight at this time. Looking down from the bridge, it was just a dense mass of black clouds, and there was no meaning to it. Jiashu remained silent and stood for a while with his back to the bridge railing. Lena turned around and said, let's go. But, Mr. Fan, you seem to have something on your mind today. The tree sighed for a long time, and did not reply to her words. Lena thought he had something to hide, so it was inconvenient to ask. The two of them walked out of the gate and got into the car together, still in silence. Waiting until the car approached the door of Tao's house, Lena said, I will only take you to the door and won't go in. If you need my help, I am willing to do my best to help. Jiashu said, thank you. After saying that, he nodded to her, stopped the car, said goodbye and went home. That evening, Jiashu thought to herself, how can I ask Lena to help me with my matter? She finally had a good impression of me, but she was so rich and noble that we couldn't be the same. The next day, I remembered what I had given Helena. Because I was going to swim in Beihai yesterday, I had not taken it away in a hurry and had left it in the upper room. He asked the old woman to move out, hired a rickshaw, and drove all the way to Hezai. When I asked the concierge, I found that he had not gotten up yet. When Jiashu thought about it, since he had never gotten up, there was no need to be alarmed. Yin took out a piece of paper and put them in the concierge together with the things he brought. As soon as Jiashu turned around, he felt a burst of fragrance coming to his nostrils. When he looked, there was a man in short clothes standing beside him, holding a small white rattan basket in his hand. The floating surface of the basket was covered with several young lotus leaves. Under the lotus leaves, a bunch of flower stalks more than 1 foot long were exposed. The concierge said, coarse flowers. We have people here who go to the vegetable market every morning and bring them back. Are there no flowers? Who taught you to give these? The man lifted the lotus leaf, and there was another burst of fragrance. The lotus leaves in the basket hold bright red, white and white flowers. The man picked up a bouquet of coral tuberose and a bouquet of hosta flowers, and said, this is for the lady to put in a vase. It doesn't count. After saying that, he picked up 2 more bouquets of flowers, one with jasmine flowers. The ball is made of white orchids. The concierge said, you gave me another gift today. How much does it cost? The man said, let's count it as 3 yuan today. He smiled at the concierge. Jiashu listened on the side and was surprised, because he asked, why are they so expensive? The florist looked at the family tree and said with a smile, sir, you are from the south. Do you sell the jasmine and white orchids in Beijing at the southern price? I send flowers here every day. I don't dare to say more about the money. I don't want to sell them here. Jiashu said, is the price for selling flowers here every day? Dee said, it's probably more or less the same. The eldest lady here loves flowers very much. She does business worth 800 yuans to me every year. Jiashu nodded and went back on his own. As soon as he got home, Helena called. I'm very sorry that I was unwelcome just now. I never wake up so late. I came back late last night and fell asleep at 3 o'clock, so I went to bed very late today. I'm sorry. Jiashu promised her. I went to my house as soon as I woke up. Lena asked him, are you at home today? Jiashu promised. After returning to Beijing, I have to see many friends. I'm afraid there will be 2. It's a busy day. Lena had no choice but to say goodbye. In fact, Jiashu didn't go out all day that day. After reading a few pages of homework, I still couldn't calm down, so I wrote a long diary. There are few words in the diary. I used to see women wearing dancing shoes that cost hundreds of dollars a year, and I was already surprised. Today I even saw a woman who spent $1,000 a year on plugs. Diversity. So I laughed at how rare it was before. I wonder if I will see women who can spend more money than this. Or maybe what happened today will become rare and weird, and add a double circle next to the last sentence. On this day, Bohi and his wife thought that he had started preparing for the exam, so they did not disturb him. The next day, which was already the 7th day of the 7th lunar month, Jiashu remembered Shugu's date. After lunch, he took some change with him and went to Guan's house. Far away at the entrance of the alley, I saw Shugu waiting outside the door. When the car approached, she went in again. After walking in, Shofeng came from the house to the yard and said with a smile, "There's no need to go in. We want to drink tea and talk. Let's go to Shichahai to talk." Jiashu knew the old man's temper very well, so he asked, "Big, where's the girl? Let's go together." Shugu coughed twice in the room, straightened her clothes and walked out. Shofeng was impatient to wait and had already gone out, followed by Shugu and Jiashu. Shugu herself wore a white coat and a black skirt. A pair of old leather shoes that were newly collected at the shoe stall yesterday were polished and worn today. Walking next to a young man who looks like a student, it makes her look like a simple and civilized woman. After walking out of the alley, Shofeng was about to hire a car, so Shugu said, "The road is not far, let's go." As she walked, she was thinking in her heart, if she met acquaintances, what would happen if they saw me in my condition today? You won't be suspicious of me. I remember that I once dreamed about traveling to the park together, and now I have clearly fulfilled this dream. She just thought about it deeply, forgetting everything. When she arrived at Shichahai, her eyes suddenly opened up, and then suddenly realized. Jiashu stood behind Shofeng and walked to the seaside. It turned out that the so-called sea person was an empty name. All I saw was a green patchwork of paddy fields in front of me. In the middle of the paddy fields, there was a sloping earth embankment running straight through it from south to north. The earthen embankment was several feet wide, and there were big willow trees 7 or 8 feet high. The willow trees were connected one to another, and the earthen embankment turned into a willow bank. The paddy fields are approximately 4 or 5 miles apart. On the willow bank, rooftops, towers and palaces are exposed. Although there are no decorations here, it is refreshing and pleasant. All tourists who come to visit walk on the earth embankment. Under the willow trees, temporary reed mat tents were set up, and there were taverns, tea houses, and jugglers. Shofeng took Jiashu for most of the embankment, but turned around and asked with a smile, "What do you think of this place? Is it interesting?" Jiashu smiled and said, "It's cleaner than the overpass anyway." Shofeng said with a smile, "That's it. You don't really like this place. So, let's find a place to sit first." So the three of them slowed down and found seats on both sides. In the reed mat shed, a man came out and blocked the road. He nodded to the three of them and said with a smile, "You three, have a rest. Our place is clean and has a small garden, which is very elegant." When Jiashu looked at the shed, it is open on 3 sides, facing a paddy field far to the southeast. The lotus leaves planted in the paddy field are matted and stretched straight to the shore. A few red lacquered tables were set up under the shade of the willow trees outside the shed, and he said to Shofeng, "This is it." Before Shofeng could answer, the waiter was already shouting about handkerchiefs, and in fact he had to go in. The three of them picked a seat facing the paddy field and sat down. The waiter brought them tea. Jiashu asked first, "You said there was a small garden here. Where's the garden?" The waiter pointed and smiled, and said, "Isn't it there?" When everyone looked, they found that a piece of land as big as a dining table had been dug under the shade of the willows, and some colorful trumpet flowers and purslane were planted. Several bamboo poles and wooden sticks were inserted along the loose soil, and a net was woven with thin and thick ropes, on which climbed lentil and loofah vines, and a few red and yellow flowers were in bloom. Everyone smiled when they saw it. Jiashu said, "It's the same with everything in the world. Seeing is worse than hearing about it. I've been to Tairaning in Beijing. It's a dilapidated temple in a reed pond under the city wall. Now we're at Shichahai, which is now some wild fields." Shofeng said, You can't blame the legend for being wrong. It's because of changes in human affairs. Tairanning used to be surrounded by water and trees. 100 years ago, you could still row a boat there. Now the water is dry, the trees are gone, and the temple is broken. As for Shichahai, I saw it with my own eyes. It's all a vast lake. There are some lotus flowers in the shallow water. The water here is the running water from Yuquan Mountain, which flows all the way to the Three Seas. In the past, the Jinong altar and the Sheiji altar were all forbidden areas in Beijing, not to mention the Three Seas and the Summer Palace. The rich people living in Beijing are tired of spending their days in debauchery and want to find a quiet place to change their taste. There are only this place and Tairanting. As for the present, the rich people in the village always say they are going to Zishan. You see, at that time, there were no cars. Who could ride a mule cart with corpses to travel so far? But from my point of view, I still prefer to drink a sip of water under this kind of reed mat tent. It is more comfortable. Once, I went to Central Park and was thirsty. I wanted to find a seat at the tea house. Guess what? I walked over, but no one paid any attention to me. I called the waiter twice, and a man in a long white cloth coat came over. He glared at me and said, "We sell tea for 20 cents a pot." He looked at me and saw that I was a poor old man who couldn't afford tea, so I left without saying anything. You see, when I arrived at Shichahai, what was the tea house like? Here. I was still wearing the blue cloth coat I wore last time I went to Central Park, but he greeted me from a distance and invited me to sit inside. Jiashu smiled and said, "That's good." The uncle didn't beat up the waiter in the park. He is also a poor boy like me, so there is no need to bother with him. It seems that Shichahai used to not welcome friends in blue cloth gowns, but now people wearing silk clothes rarely come, so friends in blue cloth gowns are the guests. Maybe Central Park will have such a day in the future. Jiashu said, "Mulberry fields become seas and seas become mulberry fields. Things in ancient and modern times are unpredictable. If the Three Seas in Beijing are changed into four seas, and Shichahai is surrounded by red walls and built into palaces, then of course, the paddy fields here will become flower beds." As he said this, he pointed to the southern corner, to the palace wall among the green willows. Just as he pointed, he suddenly saw a car coming straight up the willow embankment from the south bank. The people on the embankment moved aside. Although Shichahai is a natural park, the police station also has management rules. Cars and horses stop at both ends and are not allowed to drive into the willow embankment. This car was the only one that could drive into the crowd, probably another official. Shofeng also saw it and said, "We just said that the rich people would come, and the rich people are here. If the rich people are all riding tigers and rushing around like this, then it would be better if this place didn't become a park. Because as it is now, we can still come here to sway, but if it shakes, we will lose another place to visit." Jiashu smiled as he listened. He turned around and saw the car parked opposite the tea house. On both sides of the car stood 4 guards with swords and cannons. They jumped out of the car and opened the door. The 3 people sitting beside Jiashu couldn't help but pay attention to see who the rich man was. When the man got out of the car, everyone was surprised. It turned out that he was not a valiant warrior or a well-dressed gentleman, but a young woman dressed in silk. When they looked more closely, the girl was none other than Fan Jiashu. Jiashu stood up, pressed his hands on the table, exclaimed "Ah," stared, and was stunned and speechless. When Fan Jiashu got out of the car, she had not looked over here. When Jiashu exclaimed "Ah," she looked up and said something to the 4 guards. She immediately shrank back, held the car door, and got into the car. Then the 4 guards also got into the car and stood on both sides. Immediately, the car whirred and drove away. Jiashu had not seen Fan Jiashu clearly before she looked up, so he could not make a conclusion. When he saw it clearly, Fan Jiashu turned around suddenly, and her foot was on the pedal under the car door. The folds of her printed gauze blouse fluttered in the wind. As the lapels of her clothes fluttered, Jiashu also saw the dancing socks on her legs. Jiashu remembered that Fan Jiashu had asked to buy dancing socks before, but he did not buy them because ordinary socks cost 8 yuan a pair. He also advised her not to be so extravagant, but now it was as he wished. While he was thinking, the car disappeared amid the honking of the horn. Shugu was sitting facing the road outside the reed shed, so she could see it more clearly. She knew that Jiashu must be very upset, and she wanted to comfort him, but she didn't know how to say it. Jiashu stared at the outside of the tea shed, and Shugu stared at Jiashu's face. Shu Feng was surprised at first, but then he understood. He stood up, patted Jiashu on the shoulder, and said, "Brother, what did you see?" Jiashu nodded, sat down, sighed slightly, and looked at Shugu. Shu Feng asked, "My eyesight is not very good. I didn't see the man who got off the car just now, clearly. Is he surnamed Shen?" Shugu said, "It's only been 2 days, and you saw him. Why are you asking me?" Shu Feng said, "Although it's only been 2 days, the place is different, the clothes are different, and the aura is even more different. Who would have thought?" After hearing what Shu Feng said, Joshu's face turned pale. He took a sip of tea from a full cup and put it down. He put it down and took a sip again, but he didn't say anything. Shugu thought, "You should be devoted to her, and no longer miss her." So she said to Shu Feng, "Just now I wanted to go forward and look at her. Anyway, I am also a woman. Even if she has 4 guards, I don't think she can do anything to me." Shu Feng said, "That's called meddling. Why bother with such a person? She has the face to see us, but we don't have the face to see her. At least she still has a little shame and avoids us." Joshu touched the teacup, shook his head, and sighed again. Shu Feng smiled and said, "Brother Fan, I know you feel a little bad, but you just said that mulberry fields become the sea, and the sea becomes mulberry fields. Such a big thing can change at any time, let alone a person. I said something unpleasant, and you just think that she died of an acute illness during this trip to the south. Isn't that the end of it?" Shugu smiled and said, "What you said is a little inappropriate. Why don't you just think that you didn't know her before? If she really died of an acute illness, would Mr. Fan be like this?" Shugu just finished saying this, and suddenly changed her mind. "What I said is even more inappropriate. How do I know that he can't do this? As a woman, why do I criticize a man's attitude towards women? Doesn't this show a frivolous look?" So she first peeked at Shu Feng, and then at Joshu, and saw that they didn't say anything, and her color was settled. Joshu pondered for a long time, as if he had realized something, then nodded and said to Shu Feng, "Things in the world are hard to predict. She is a weak woman, and she is guarded by 4 guards. What can she do? If she really greets us, not only will she be in danger, but I am afraid that we will be implicated." Shu Feng laughed and said, "Brother, you are too easy to talk to. I am angry for you, but you think it's okay." Joshu said, "I would rather let others betray me." Although Shu Feng didn't know much about literature, he understood this sentence. So he stroked his beard with his hand, and sighed. Shugu didn't say anything, but smiled at him. Laughing is the command of the first feeling. When the second feeling occurs, he thinks that this smile is a bit inappropriate, and quickly opens the small white folding fan in his hand and covers it under his nose. Joshu also felt that what he said was a bit too much, so he didn't dare to say more. After sitting and talking for a while, Shu Feng met 2 acquaintances. The friend insisted on pulling him over to talk, so Joshu and Shugu were left here. The 2 sat in silence for a while. Joshu felt that it would be bad to keep silent, so he asked, "I have been in the south for more than a month. Mrs. Buddhist knowledge must have improved a lot. What Buddhist scriptures have you read now?" Shugu shook her head and smiled. "No Buddhist scriptures." Joshu said, "Why should I hide it from you? Last time I went to your house, I saw the young lady lit a burner of incense, and was about to recite scriptures." Shugu said, "It's just the Diamond Sutra and the Heart Sutra. Last time the master gave me a copy of the Lotus Sutra, I couldn't understand it, and my father said that young people should not read Buddhist scriptures. It would be a bit of a dampening of ambition. If there is some opposition, I will not force it." "Mr. Fan is against learning Buddhism, right?" Joshu shook his head and said, "No, I am willing to learn Buddhism too." Shugu said, "Mr. Fan has a bright future. It is not worth it for him to learn Buddhism for a little unsatisfactory thing." Joshu said, "There is not everything worth doing in the world. We can only see through it a little bit." Shugu said, "Mr. Fan is really kind to others, but it's a pity that he doesn't know what is good and what is bad." Joshu dipped his finger in the leftover tea in the teacup and wiped it on the table. He wrote several good characters in a row. Shu Feng came back and smiled and said, "Hey, what are you thinking about? Write so many good characters." Joshu smiled, stood up and said, "We have been sitting for a long time, let's go back." Shoufeng saw that he was restless, so he didn't force him to stay and asked him to take a look at the open-air playground here. After paying for tea, they walked along the main road to the south. They saw reed sheds gradually connected under the willow shade. In addition to tea and wine stalls, there were people practicing martial arts, telling crosstalk, singing opera, and playing picture slides. At the end, there was a reed-roofed theater. Jiashu found it interesting and relieved some of his boredom. He walked over again and heard the sound of strings and drums blowing in the wind. When he looked, he saw that it was under the willow tree by the water. There was an old man with a girl singing drum books. There were also several long benches with short legs around. When Jiashu saw this phenomenon, he couldn't help but think of the past. He felt dizzy and almost fell to the ground. He quickly held his head with one hand and stood still. Shoufeng rushed forward, supported him, and said, "What's wrong with you? Did you get heat stroke?" Jiashu said, "That's right. I smelled a bad smell and felt dizzy." Feng saw a tea house on the side of the road and helped him sit down. Shugu said, "Mr. Fan probably can't sit still. I'll go hire a car to take Mr. Fan back." She walked forward alone and encountered another reed roof stage. This stage was more neat. On the rope fence at the door, there was a large red paper poster with a large message on it. "Today is the 7th day of the 7th month, and the good play The Love of the Heaven and the River is being performed." Shugu suddenly remembered that her father had made an appointment to meet at Shichihai today. It couldn't be completely unintentional. They were talking, well, and then they met that person again. But he saw that the person was not angry, but forgave her very much. So, if the person didn't come today, what could he do? This is very good, and he can see through his character. Shugu just thought about it, but forgot to hire a car. Shoufeng suddenly shouted from behind, "What's wrong?" When he looked back, Jiashu had followed Shoufeng all the way behind. Jiashu smiled and said, "Why are you so distracted by the play? Do you want to listen to the play?" Shugu smiled and shook her head, but saw that he was walking normally and his face was calm. So he said, "Is Mr. Fan okay? You scared me just now." Although he didn't notice the jump, it was inconvenient to say that he wanted to play again, so he had to leave silently. When they arrived at the south bank, next to the wall of Beihai, there was a row of rickshaws parked, which could be hired at will. Jiashu stood there for a while, and asked Shoufeng, "Uncle, are we parting?" Shoufeng said, "You are not feeling well, go back, maybe we can take a stroll here." Shugu stood under the willow tree, and the long willow branches hanging down were like a green curtain, draped over her shoulders. She reached out and grabbed a willow branch, holding it with her folding fan, and with her right hand, she pulled the green leaves off the willow branches one by one and threw them to the ground, just looking at Shoufeng and Jiashu talking, without answering. The rickshaw drivers parked on the side of the road all thought, "These three people stood here and didn't leave, they must be going to hire a car." Like a gust of wind, more than 10 rickshaw drivers surrounded him, vying to ask if he wanted a rickshaw. Jiashu was surrounded by them and had no choice but to get on a rickshaw and drive away. He just took off his hat on the rickshaw, nodded to Shoufeng and said goodbye. Shoufeng said to Shugu, "We are fine. Today is a festival. I will take you for a walk." After hearing this, Shugu put down the willow branch in her hand and followed her father. Shoufeng said, "What's the matter? You are so depressed. Are you also suffering from heat stroke?" Shugu smiled and said, "What kind of heat stroke am I suffering from? I don't have such a good life." Shoufeng said, "What are you talking about? Whether you have heat stroke or not, do you still talk about your good or bad life?" Shugu still followed Shoufeng silently without answering. Shoufeng saw that she was so unhappy, so he didn't have any interest in going out. So the two of them walked slowly back home. After arriving home, the sky gradually darkened. After dinner, Shugu washed her hands and face, and calmed down. She was about to take out a Buddhist scripture to read, but she heard someone in the yard say, "Big girl, don't you come out and take a look? The Milky Way in the sky is so bright today." Shugu said, "It happens every night. What's there to see?" Someone outside the yard answered, "Tonight, the cowherd and the weaver girl will meet." Shugu was about to agree, but someone said, "Don't look at the cowherd and the weaver girl in the sky. Let the cowherd look at us. They meet once a year in the sky, and look at the people on the ground. Many of them are separated by life and death today. People change one shift, and then another. They meet once a year. How wonderful. Let's not worry about the gods, worry about ourselves." After hearing this, Shugu couldn't help but be dazed, put aside the idea of reading the Buddhist scriptures, and went to sleep. Since this weather, Shugu felt something, sometimes very happy, sometimes very worried, just feeling uneasy. But after that weather, Jiashu did not come again for 3 days. Shugu said to Shofeng, "Mr. Fan is not like before this time. After not seeing him for a few days, maybe he will have some accidents. We should go to see him." Shofeng said, "If I could go to see him, I would have been in contact with him a long time ago. His relatives always look at us as inferiors. If we run into a snag when we go, it's not a big deal. But if his relatives say something bad about Mr. Fan, how can they put it aside?" Shugu frowned and said, "That's true. But if they have something unhappy, we don't go to see them. It seems to be unfair." Shofeng said, "Okay, I'll go to see him tonight." Shugu smiled and said, "I'm not troubling you. This is really what you should do." The father and daughter made such an appointment, but unexpectedly, on this night, Shofeng felt a little uncomfortable, and there was also the sound of dripping rain under the eaves. Shugu did not let her father go to see Jiashu, thinking that the weather would be fine. Shofeng thought it was nothing serious and fell asleep. But at this time, Jiashu was indeed ill, because the school exams were approaching and he had to prepare for his homework, which made him feel even more tired. That night, he only drank a little porridge, and then reluctantly pulled himself together to read under the electric light. It happened that on this night, Bohi and his wife did not go out. They invited a few guests to play mahjong in the upper room. The more upset people are, the more disturbed they are by the clattering of cards. Although he turned a deaf ear to it, he could not calm down. It seemed that a cool air came in through the screen window. In addition, there was only a copper lamp on the table in the room, covered with green silk, which made the room look even gloomier. Jiashu looked up by chance and saw the calendar hanging on the wall. It was already the 11th day of the 7th lunar month. The moon tonight should be half round. The moonlight in the year is the best, in autumn. Since he was upset, he might as well go outside to see the moonlight for entertainment. So he turned off the lights, walked out of the house, and walked in the corridor. When he looked up at the sky, the flower stand in the yard blocked the sky from being seen. So he turned a corner and came to an inner courtyard on the left. In the north of the yard, there were 3 rooms in a row, which was Bohi's study, decorated very elegantly. And Bohi himself, perhaps, did not come to the study once a week, so it felt even more quiet here. There was a small rockery in the yard, and 2 clumps of small bamboos were planted against the hill. In the middle of the yard, there were 4 tall sycamore trees planted in a row. This place always had the air of autumn, and in this gloomy night, the yard looked even more desolate and bleak. Looking up at the sky, there were dark clouds everywhere, but there were a few stars where the clouds did not meet. The half moon was just a faint scattered light in the clouds vaguely, and the whole moon shadow could not be seen. The cloud just kept moving, as if the moon was moving in the cloud. Later, the moon came out of the cloud, and the green leaves of the sycamore trees were shining. The steps were also wet. It turned out that it had rained at night, but I didn't know it. The moon was shining, hanging on a horizontal branch of the sycamore tree, which was very poetic. I was very depressed, and I thought that looking at the moon could relieve my boredom. So I didn't tell anyone and took a canvas bed and set it up under the corridor to watch the moon. Unexpectedly, in the blink of an eye, the moon on the leaves of the sycamore disappeared, and the remaining stars outside the clouds disappeared. The whole yard was dark, and the sycamore trees were just a few tall shadows in the darkness. Not long after, there was a sound of puffing from the branches to the ground. Jiashu thought, could it be raining? So he walked down the stone steps and looked up. It was raining very fine and dense silk. Although I couldn't see the raindrops in the dark night, I felt that the raindrops were coming from the gaps between the trees with cold air and coming towards me. There were many raindrops on the leaves of the sycamore trees, and from time to time, large drops of water fell to the ground. Jiashu was just looking at it, and a sycamore leaf fell on his face with the accumulated rain. Jiashu was hit by the leaf, and his face was frozen for a moment, and he felt a little cold, so he went to the corridor and lay on the canvas bed again. Now, Jiashu only felt the silence of the yard, and he could not hear the sound of playing cards in the yard over there. Only the accumulated raindrops on the sycamore trees fell down, and each sound was very clear. In this environment, the endless worries came to his heart, and he didn't know where he was. Joshua was just thinking like this, and suddenly a sycamore tree stood up without wind, and immediately there was a rustling sound, and drops of water and leaves fell all over the ground. I was surprised by this sudden phenomenon. I didn't know why. I hurried back to the room and turned on the table lamp. I saw a note under the ink box with 8 words as big as a wine glass. The wind and rain are deceiving people. Take care of yourself. I looked at the small glass clock on the table, and it was past 2 o'clock. Who would leave a note here at this time? It was a bit strange. If you want to know where this note came from, I will explain it next time. Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.